Welcome everyone to another webinar from Agile Velocity. Today we have Agile coach and trainer and CEO of Agile Velocity, David Hawks, who will be presenting today's topic, Accelerating Through Chaos, the Path to Agility. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to David.
Thank you, Jessica. So what we'd like to walk through today, I've identified 5 top challenges or struggles that we see folks have as they're trying to adopt Agile practices. We're going to be walking through those and kind of answering how do we resolve those, what's the impact, and how do we resolve those via the path to agility. I'm David Hawks. I have been introduced. And I don't know that there's a whole lot more that I need to say there, Jessica. All right, so let's jump in. We'll be walking through this framework kind of incrementally as we go, but we'll start here. So what I've done is kind of looked at the industry as a whole, and I kind of see a few different levels of agility out there, and so I've done at a couple different talks now a survey polling of the audience, and going from superficial agility where people are like doing Scrum but not being very agile, or implementing SAFe but not really with a whole lot of agility. So it kind of looks like we're going through the motions. We might be just having it's like Scrum lipstick on a waterfall pig that we got going on, but we're not really moving faster or getting things done every sprint. And then we get into maybe a level of improving where like we are trying to get better. The Scrum Master is trying to coach the team. There actually is a Scrum Master. The team is starting to measure velocity. We're starting to get visibility to all of our work, but we maybe haven't gotten a lot of gains yet as we're going along. So we're in that improving stage. Then we get to predictable, where we're limiting our carryover, our teams have focus, we have a predictable cadence of delivering, and then we have fast agility on the highest. So think about where your organization kind of fits. Where would you kind of say that your organization or your team, is it, we're kind of like on the superficial side, or we're improving, but are we actually predictable? Are we fast? See if this aligns with you. What we have seen is that in the polls that we've done, 86% of folks that we have polled have been in the superficial and improving agility, which means we haven't really gotten a lot of gains. So this kind of validated my hunch that there's a lot more kind of bad Agile out there than there is good Agile. And what I want to talk to you about today is, where do I see the major struggles? Why is that the case? Why is there more bad Agile than good Agile? And how do we overcome those obstacles within our organization? So that's the premise of today and what we're going to be kind of talking through. So let's start with this. Anytime we introduce change, we always get worse before we get better. And this is a natural kind of human reaction, because we started out in what we call status quo, and when we introduce this change, what happens is we enter a period of what we call chaos and resistance. And this is natural. Like we knew how to play by the old rules, and we were at status quo, everybody was happy, and then all of a sudden things change and people get scared, they get fear for their job. They knew how to be a hero in the old world, and they're not sure if they can be a hero in the new world. And so until we get some things figured out, people are kind of worried, right? And that's okay, right? We need, as leaders, we need to support folks as we're introducing these changes and say, hey, you might be in this resistance stage, and that's okay. We're going to start, what concerns do you have? What questions do you have? And let's work through those things together. And as we get to kind of the bottom, is like when we figured out that there's new rules, but we suck at these new rules. Like, we're like, okay, I now know and I understand how this is supposed to work, but I'm not very good at it. So we start what we call integrating and practicing these new rules. So that's as that we start getting the uplift here, is when we start saying, okay, integration and practice. So we start practicing these new things. So, you know, one of the big ones in Agile is like teams need to start figuring out how to break work down to fit into the 2-week sprint. Well, at first, they suck at that. And at first, actually, the change, they're like, well, this is arbitrary. Why are we doing it? You know, total resistance of it. And then once we start figuring out, okay, if we can get things smaller and done in 2 weeks, we can get feedback on it. We can validate that we're building the right thing. And then we can actually save time in the long run because we're going to get, you know, shorten these feedback loops and tune as we go. So we go through integration and practice, and then we hopefully get to a new status quo that's better than where we started. Now, many of us have been part of change initiatives that started out and never really got better, or that like we made a change and we're like, that's not working, let's make another change and another change and another change, and we just get worse, worse, and worse. So the question is, are we providing the right support in our organizations and the right leadership and the right mechanics in place to kind of lead these change initiatives? And so what we've done with the Path to Agility is taken and applied organizational change models, generic ones, not anything specific to Agile, and started to figure out how does that apply into this Agile space. And what we found is what the Path to Agility really can do is help organizations accelerate through this learning curve and reduce the risk of how deep they go, right? And how long they're sitting in this kind of trough where we're potentially underperforming. Every executive I ever talked to says, you know, yeah, we're going to move to Agile, but we can't go any slower, right? Like, and so the question is, we need to be able to introduce these changes in a way, and hopefully what we're really doing is putting a series of kind of these little J curves in place where we're actually introducing changes and incrementally getting better over time instead of just some big bang kind of change. So that's the overall premise. And what we've done is taken this and started to look at and say, you know what, there's different stages of maturity. I made the mistake early on in my coaching career when I first founded Agile Velocity, that the first client that I had, I came in and I evaluated and assessed where they were. I discovered that they, you know, were at what I would maybe call like 10 to 20 mile an hour Agile. And I had seen 100 mile an hour Agile, and I was like, all right, we need to get you to 100 mile an hour Agile overnight, right? And the reality is they weren't ready. Like I was trying to pull them up here, and I really needed to focus on how do I get them from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40, and then 30 to 40 to 70 to 80, right? And the things that we are implementing at 70 to 80, we might throw away some of the stuff that we did early on. And so part of Path to Agility is helping us kind of navigate those waters, trying to assess where are you today? Are you in superficial? Are you improving? Are you predictable? And then figuring out what's the right thing to apply from there. So let's look at the first challenge that I see. So the first challenge or obstacle to success that many organizations have is what I call implementing solutions without focus on achieving results. So just saying like, our goal is to be Agile, so we're going to apply Agile, or our goal is to implement SAFe, so we're going to launch a bunch of release trains, right? But what really is the goal of the business? Why would we apply that solution, and how will we measure success, right? If we don't have a clear goal that's a business objective around achieving results, then we'll tend to see lots of resistance for a longer period of time, because people are being asked to change and they don't know why, right? And they're not motivated to change. They're just like, why can't we just go back to the way it was working? Unless we provide some vision, some direction, some compelling thing, then we're going to get a lot of this resistance. We also see, if we don't have an overarching goal of the organization, then we start to see what we call silo optimization. So we're optimizing, like the dev manager's optimizing, the QA manager's optimizing. And then also we're making all these changes, but nobody knows how to measure success, right? So there's no focus around the initiative and what we're trying to do. So in order to solve that, what we see is that the first stage of the Path to Agility is that we need to make sure we have alignment. Now, alignment, when we think about this stage at an organizational level, And today I'm going to focus more on the organizational level than the team level. So we've got kind of path to agility at a team level as well. But at an organizational level, the first thing that we engage with the leadership is why. Like, why are we doing this? What is the compelling reason? And is there a sense of urgency around that? Right? If people are like, you know what, we think we could be a little bit better, well, that's probably not enough pain to put people through this change initiative, right? So if we're asking people to go through this pain curve, then we better have something that's really exciting up here at the top that we're trying to shoot for. So we want to get clear on why. And it needs to be from a business perspective. It's imperative that we shorten our time to market because we're getting killed in the market because we're not responding fast enough, and our competitors are. And if we don't, start working in a more, competitive way, then we're just going to lose, right? We're going to lose in the market, and the company's going to dwindle and die, right? So like, oh, okay, like if everybody knew that, everybody was aligned around that. So that's the first part of alignment. The second part of alignment is starting to look at, okay, how are we going to run this change initiative, right? So what is the organizational change kind of plan? How are we going to approach this? And are we going to do this in a methodical way, right? And so we borrow a lot of things from a change model from Kotter's 8 steps to organizational change. And one of the first things that he talks about is first creating a sense of urgency, right, around why and a compelling vision. But also he talks about creating a guiding coalition. We call it an agile leadership team. And the idea is that you're building a team of leaders who are responsible for communicating this vision, making it compelling, articulating it, and then managing this change over, the stages that we go through. So that's one of the first things that we want to kick off. And then one of the things we're going to ask that team and the organization is, are we really ready, right? Like, so do we have our teams aligned correctly? Do we have product owners? Do we have scrum masters? Where are all those going to come from? Do we need training? What are all the things that we need in place in order to be successful? So first thing we need to do is align around all of that. And so when we go back to this problem, right, and we see this impact, right, the solutions here are we creating an ALT that's going to drive this initiative, right? Is this is this initiative a priority? Right? So is this initiative being made a priority? Is there visibility across the organization that's a priority? Not only do we have the ALT, but do we have executives that are active stakeholders, right? So are they actually involved? They may not necessarily need to be on the ALT, but is the ALT doing like a sprint review to the executives, and are the executives engaged, and are they helping remove impediments that are appearing? And are we educating kind of the leadership around what's involved, what's the organizational impact, how the leaders' roles are going to change? Are we putting those things in place around this, and again, tying it all back into the why, the vision, the purpose? Now let's look at the second problem, right? So the second problem we see is that there's no mechanisms in place to resolve organizational level cross-departmental impediments. So I talk a lot about how the fastest way for things to fall apart is what I call empowering the resistance. So think about this scenario. Say a team has been told, like, you guys got to be agile, and they're starting to have retros, and they identify some impediments that they can't solve themselves, so they escalate them up to leadership. They escalate these issues up to leadership, and leadership doesn't do anything with it. What signal does that send to that team about how serious leadership is around this organization, this change and moving to agile? If everything that's being escalated up to them they don't treat as a priority, it doesn't get resolved quickly, what's going to happen is and you have these teams that are already got pockets of resistance. And so all of a sudden they're going to be like, you know what? They're not really serious about this. I'm not going to go through all the pain that we talked about up here. I'm just going to wait this thing out. It's just going to be a fad, and it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy that things are just not going to work out. Right? So leadership is a big part of this next stage that we call learn. So at a team level, learn is obvious. It's like put basic Scrum practices in place. But what does that mean from an organizational perspective? So from an organizational perspective, the big thing that we talk about here is, are we actually empowering these teams? Are we creating a safe to fail environment for these teams? Are we responding to the needs of these teams? Are we holding them accountable and transferring ownership to the teams, or are the managers still meddling in everything and task mastering and telling everybody what to do? So, is ownership transferring from leadership down to the team level? Are we putting the things in place in order to do that? Part of what we do in order to make that happen, and this was our last webinar that we did, was around these kind of concepts we call modern leadership. So, we developed a service around a leadership cohort where we assess where leadership is today, how reactive versus creative they are. Are we developing the skills? Because now we're switching from, probably most companies are in more of a command and control style to more of a servant leadership style, and nobody's been trained on how to do that, right? Like, so they're not going to just figure it out overnight. We've got to go in and figure out and help the leaders figure out a new style of leading in order to support these teams. And then tying back to our organizational change plan, we really need to think about how are we actually facilitating the change. So how are this ALT, right? So facilitating the change, how are they interacting? So we like to actually take an ALT and run it like Agile. So we're going to have a backlog. We're going to prioritize it. The ALT is going to have regular huddles. They're going to have a product owner. They're going to have a Scrum Master. And we're going to manage this initiative. And so as the team escalates things, it goes on that board. That board is going to be visible so everybody in the organization can see it, which means now we're applying some accountability. But it also has the leadership team demonstrating, like, we're going to eat the dog food too, right? So like, we're going to go do this, and we're demonstrating the same behaviors and trying to learn this stuff at the same time that the teams are starting to learn things. So we've got to learn. We're starting to apply these practices. It doesn't mean we're good at them yet, but we're starting to change and learn how to work in a different way organizationally, how to operate, and how do we start addressing the impediments that emerge organizationally. So if we go back to number 2 here, right, no mechanisms in place, right? So this is where the ALT is actually, actively working impediments. And this is treated as a priority, that we are resolving things as quickly as we can, right? So if we can start putting those things in place and it needs to be cross-functional ALT in order to do that, right? Those are the things that we want to start doing, and we want to start changing kind of that leadership paradigm, right? So as far as the leadership approach, right? Are we doing any kind of leadership coaching, leadership development? What is happening at that leadership level? All right, so what 2 big issues there that kind of can keep us from really getting out of the gate, if you will. Those definitely would lead to more of a if we don't do 1 and 2, we're probably going to stay at a superficial agility level. So let's say we've accomplished those 2 and we're improving, but number 3 is going to impact our ability to get predictable. So number 3 is that we're not organizationally creating any mechanisms or have the discipline for leadership to actually create focus. So what happens, the analogy we use a lot is that, most organizations the leadership is like trying to shove more paper in the printer in order to get it to go faster, right? Which all they're doing is jamming the printer, which is just causing lots of interruptions, which is just slowing the system down. And it's causing a lot of volatility and variability to our ability to forecast how much we can get done. So what's happening is, I use the analogy that it's like the organization is driving a car, but the car's got an iced over windshield and no working fuel gauge, but it's going really fast. So we're doing a lot of work. Everybody's busy, but we can't see where we're going. And when I talk to CEOs, that's what they feel when they think about the tech organization. They're like, it's a black hole. Like, I have no idea. Like, we ask for stuff or we demand things by certain dates, and we have no idea when it's going to come out the other end. We have no visibility, right? And a lot of it is, it's kind of, it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Because if we're just pushing things in, we talk a lot about shifting from push to pull. If we're just pushing things in, well, then we're interrupting all the time. We're not creating focus. So there's an organizational dynamic that we have to do in order to address these concerns. And this is what we're talking about when we get to the third stage, which is what we call predict. So at predict, the first thing that we need to do is actually create focus as an organization. So when we talk about create focus, what's involved in doing that? So the first thing is, do we have any kind of portfolio prioritization process, and maybe more important, portfolio sequencing process? So as things come in, are we sequencing them in a way? Are we limiting work in process as an organization, so that our teams can focus in order to increase our predictability and to increase our throughput, right? Because we know multitasking slows things down. So if we're always interrupting our teams, well then, and they're not focused, then they're not going to be very productive. They're not going to be predictable. They're not going to be productive. So if we can start creating focus, and then the second thing that we really start focusing on is what we call reducing complexity. So, there's the big, exciting thing in the Agile space right now is scaling and safe, and everybody, what scaling framework are we using? Well, the first thing that we would start with is, have we looked at ways to descale? Have we looked at ways to simplify the problems? Instead of applying a big, heavy framework to manage all the complexity of the way we've always worked, maybe if we realigned how we're structured, we could actually reduce the complexity and simplify the problem, and then figure out just enough process to support that. So let me give you an example. Many companies, and especially as we get larger, we have a lot of projects, and we break projects down and we assign work out to teams, like the back end team and the front end team and the middle tier team, and then we're managing all these dependencies across all these teams, and then something blows up over here, so then we got to change the priorities over there, and we got project managers running around trying to get status from everybody, because it's a really complex system. And maybe one way to simplify that would be to create cross-functional teams, cross-functional feature teams focused on value and products. And if we created teams that were focused on value and products, and we had somebody like a product owner, product manager, prioritizing the work coming into those teams, we have reduced how many dependencies are across teams, because we put all the dependencies within the team, or most of the dependencies within the team, right? And so we don't need to apply near as heavy of mechanisms on top, and we've also created focus at the same time, and it's simpler for us to make business decisions around priorities and sequencing, right? And so those are the types of things that we would look at, and then say, all right, maybe we still need some, like a big room planning type of activity, or maybe we still want to align our sprints, or do scrum of scrums, or have some kind of release train type of alignment. But let's figure out what practices are the right practices to apply. But the first thing we want to do is look at how can we reduce complexity and descale as we go. If we do those things, it's going to give us the outcome of our ability to forecast, right, and make informed business decisions. And I think most organizations don't put this as their highest priority, but I think if I really would dig in with a CEO, this is what they really would just love to have, which is, hey, just tell me when we come up with a new idea and we're going to add that in as scope, what would be the impact of something that might have to come out that's lower priority? Are we able to make those types of decisions? Can we forecast enough to, say, all right, here's what we think we can get done over the next 90 days, and as something changes in the next 20 days, we know what the impact of that change is. So we want to get to that ability. Now, there's a bunch of things we need to do at a team level as well, like teach teams how to swarm and have team ownership instead of working in silos, create more T-shaped people, getting done every sprint, not having carryover, which means they have to figure out how to break work down. They got to get good at story point estimation, bunch of things at team level, lots of things that are documented out there, right? But if the teams aren't cross-functional because it's an organizational problem, we're probably not going to get very far, even if we try and do all those team level practices. So if we go back to the solutions for problem number 3 here, right? The first thing we want to look at is, what are we doing from an org level portfolio planning standpoint? And some organizations will help them implement more of a Kanban view at a portfolio level and prioritize at that level. So in doing that, then we're going to start limiting WIP at this higher level, not at a team level, but limiting work in process to create focus at this level. And really, this kind of concept of descaling or reducing complexity. How can we actually, hopefully build a team or a few teams that could own the whole problem themselves, instead of it being like, we have 7 people we need across 7 different parts of the organization, and you've got 7 different managers and 3 different VPs involved, all in order to be able to get some value delivered to a customer. Most of our organizations are way too complex, and I agree our problems are complex, but I would say that we have made it even worse, right? Like, we've compounded the problem by making things more complex than they need to be. So number 4, so we're predictable, right? But maybe there's still some room for improvement. So the number 4 is that many organizations are not doing what they need to develop internal change coaches or change leaders, people who are helping continue the improvements, right? And so if you don't have people internally, then what happens is that first point underneath impact here, right? You're dependent on people like us, right? And like, while that may be, to some people say, well, that's a great thing for Agile Velocity. No, it's not. We like to work on new problems. We don't want to be there forever. We say all the time, like, our job is to work ourselves out of a job. We want to create this capability inside of an organization so that we can move on to the next problem domain. But if you don't have internal folks that are starting to learn a lot of the things that the coaches are bringing to the table, that like Agile Velocity coaches or trainers would bring to the table, then what happens is you have this codependency, and as soon as we leave, everything kind of unravels, right? And we want to create sustainable impact and sustainable improvement. And so we want to create this capability, and if we don't have this capability, then what happens is we only get optimizations in like what we call local optimizations versus a global optimization across what we call the whole value stream. So if we think about a value stream as, for software development, it would be somebody's requesting a new feature. What is the whole process that something goes through in order to deliver this value to the market, right? So what is the process? So we would get some results, we'll get some improvements, like, all right, we're more predictable, but are we really going fast? And do we have sustainable impact of improvements? And the progress, again, slows. So let's look at what the 4th stage of the path to agility is around going faster, is around what we call accelerate. So when we think about accelerate, the thing that we focus on is what we call optimize the whole. So again, the whole value stream. So from the beginning to the end, are we optimizing this? And so what this starts hitting on is we're optimizing across typically department lines, right? So a lot of times we come in, we're maybe hired by the VP of the software development or CIO or CTO, whoever's over all of like the tech side of the world. And we start doing a lot of improvements through Align, Learn, Predict there. But then when we start saying we need to go faster, like we've hit a ceiling. And we need to start impacting things upstream and downstream. What's happening in all the decision making in order to, before it gets to the team to work on, and what are all the things that happen downstream in order to get that thing into production. So with Optimize the Whole, we're looking at what is happening along this whole thing, and where are the bottlenecks, and where are the opportunities for improvement. And so we also start looking at what I was mentioning around like developing a coaching capability. So similar to back to the like modern leadership over there, are we, back then we're developing leaders. Now we're developing people who are continually challenging the status quo in the organization, challenging and helping develop, could be leaders, it could be process improvement, but continually helping the organization get better in what we're doing. And so we want to start working on those elements, and that allows us to start what we call shortening the cycle time, shortening the time in which we, it takes from, beginning to end in a process. So we're really starting to tune those types of capabilities. Here's where things like DevOps becomes really important, because that's our kind of final stage of getting to value. So we start accelerating, and in another piece we call getting more outcome driven. So are we actually focused on not only like in Predict we could be delivering stuff, but like we're not actually getting things to market, right? Like we're delivering in a predictable way, or we're like getting stuff done in a predictable way. But like here, we really want to get laser focused on like, are we actually getting, we're shortening time to value. We're getting things, closer in. So if we go back to problem number 4 here, right? So developing coaches, right? So having some internal, and you're like, well, where did it come from? Well, so you started to create earlier on Scrum Masters inside your organization. And so what starts to appear by this stage of maturity is that some of those Scrum Masters are ready. And people say, well, what do Scrum Masters do? Is that a full-time job? Well, in the beginning, it's definitely a full-time job with the team, because the team's got a lot to learn and a lot to figure out and a lot of things that we got to work through. So in the beginning, a Scrum Master is very team-focused, very downward kind of like team-focused. And then as we get to these later stages, the Scrum Master, like the team self-organizing, the team, in a year is going to do 200 and something daily scrums. They should be able to self-facilitate a daily scrum. So my time as a Scrum Master is much less focused on the team, and will become way more focused on the organization and across this whole value stream. So the team's going to start identifying even more impediments that said we could go faster, but this, but this, but this. And then the Scrum Master has now developed some coaching skills with the team level, and now they can start developing coaching skills across the organization. So the Scrum Masters, you probably have some that could become, sometimes companies call them, senior Scrum Masters. Sometimes they move them from Scrum Master to coach. Sometimes it becomes like the person that moves up and is actually managing the Scrum Masters is kind of the higher level coach in the organization. But those are all things that we want to develop. And we want to make sure that we really have this continuous, instead of CI being continuous integration, like continuous improvement culture across the organization, where we're not, too often I see companies going, well, we're going to do this Agile thing and then we'll hit a new status quo and we'll stay there. And it's like, no, we want to keep making changes, right? So how do we have a culture that is always pushing to be better? And having people in these coaching roles has, now you have people who are accountable for always pushing the organization out of kind of the safety zone, out of their comfort zone, and continually pushing to, all right, how can we improve? How can we tune? How can we get better? Where can we optimize? And looking for those ideas. And then the fifth one, the last one here, is focusing Agile solely on the tech organization. So this is something we're seeing more and more. And I said earlier, like we hit a ceiling within tech, and then what happens is the impact is that everybody sees Agile as just a tech thing. That's just what the tech group does. And the reality is that this is something that's going to impact the whole organization. And if the tech organization starts changing and the rest of the organization doesn't, then we're going to start having a lot of friction. We're going to see a lot of bottlenecks upstream and downstream in the organization. And we're going to have this whole org culture mindset that is potentially contradictory to the mindset that we've been developing within the tech organization. So, it's like, I see this a lot where it's, Agile down here in a waterfall organization. And it's kind of like, hey, you guys can do Agile, but what's the date? What's going to be in it, and lock that in. And that conflicts, right? So we will be chipping away at that throughout each of these stages. But really, when we start getting to this last stage that we call adapt, what we're really talking about here is how do we start creating what we call whole org agility, right? A whole org that's working in an agile way. And what that means is that we're all being highly responsive. We're all being highly iterative. And so that means that marketing is figuring out how to work in a more iterative and incremental way, that HR practices are changing. Instead of annual performance reviews with stack ranking, we got to think about, okay, how do we incentivize, encourage teaming? The finance department, instead of it being annual budgets and project budgets, we need to think about being more investment driven. Instead of 3-year strategic plans, we need to think about things like OKRs and how do we actually don't plan long term. We might have vision for long term, but how do we actually execute in a more incremental way, which allows the whole organization to adapt, right, as things change in the market. And so one of the key shifts mindset-wise on a product side is that we call this shifting from being more around product learning versus delivery focused. So up until this point, we could have just really been, how do we optimize getting more features faster? But the reality is there's a stat that says 64% of the features we build in the tech world are rarely or never used. 64% of the things we build are the wrong things. So when we get to adapt, we now are at a stage where we can start figuring out, okay, are we actually building the right thing? Can we implement things like lean startup principles like build, measure, learn, be more experiment driven, and start working in that way? And I know some of you are like, well, why wouldn't we start doing some of that earlier? Well, part of the issue I see is that people aren't really ready to do that because they just look at development as a bottleneck. But part of it is this: we cannot respond quickly to what at this adapt stage, we're able to say, you know what, we now can respond quickly to what the market is telling us because we have done accelerate and we have gotten faster. And we were able to do that because we got predictable. Like if something's not predictable, we can't just go faster. Like we can only tune something we can measure. So now that we're getting faster, we're able to do that because we got predictable. We're only able to get predictable because we started creating in Learn, we got visibility to the work. We got we started developing that continuous improvement culture, and we only were able to get there because we were actually aligned around the problem and had a compelling reason and measures of success of how we were doing there. So all of these things build. It's not that we wouldn't start working on some of the later things earlier. It's just that we're not really probably going to get fully fast until we get some level of predictability in place. So when we look back at that fifth problem, right? So this is where we start talking about more business unit agility. right? We start talking, so we're doing things in marketing and HR and other parts of the organization. So we're actually applying Agile, and it's just not shrink wrapped over. Maybe it's not Scrum, maybe it's more like Kanban. It does look different in other departments, but the principles, if we think about creating empowered teams, creating visibility to the work, limiting WIP so we can create focus, having a continuous improvement culture, right? The core principles of Agile apply to every team in your organization, no matter if it's in the tech group or not. And so we start applying those principles outside of the organization, leveraging the coaches that we've developed up here, right? And so those coaches are starting to help the whole organization, right? And then we start really looking at how are we making decisions as a whole org, going back to like budgets and going back to things like our HR practices and our strategic plans, and is that stuff starting to change so that we are operating in a way with more vision and then making short-term decisions, right? And then iterating based on the learning that we're getting, as opposed to making big moonshot decisions and then just trying to execute flawlessly to achieve the value. So those are my 5 things. We're at the point, I don't know, Jessica, questions have been coming in as we've been going, but if you've got questions, throw those in as I kind of wrap this kind of in a bow, right? So this is what we call Path to Agility. What we've looked at today is the organizational element of that. We also have a video that talks about the team level. We'll send that out with the webinar email that comes out later that JT will talk about. And so, when you think about these stages, again, you got to think about where are you in this path to figure out where you should focus, right? So if we're in a line, well, then maybe we need to focus on some of the why stuff, right? And implementing these things to try and accelerate you down through the path to agility. Let's see. So if you think this is something that would be applicable in your organization, or you want a similar kind of conversation with your leadership, we'd be happy to come out and talk to your leadership team. And in that, what we typically do is a dialogue of kind of, as we go through, like, so what have you done around vision, and where are you at this stage? And hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? So if you think there's some value in a dialogue with your leadership to help them potentially get exposed to what they're maybe not aware of, or to help you guys kind of build a little bit of a roadmap around that, we'd be happy to do that. You can contact me or Carrie Young, or send an email to info@Agile Velocity. And let's switch into Q&A if we have any.
Yeah, we have a couple. So the first question we have is asking about state agencies. So she asked, how would you work with a state agency that is not going out of business and is not focused on performance metrics?
Yeah, and that is interesting. So it'd be, I still would go back to, okay, what is the goal of this state agency? And it might be, well, we still are trying to serve our customers. And so the why may be, how could we serve our customers better, as opposed to saying we want to maximize profit, or something like that. So what is compelling? I mean, why are people there, right? Why do they have that job? And there's something compelling. And so what can we do to serve that? And what's in the way, right? So what are the constraints? What are the things that are getting in our way of building that? So I would still focus on a line around trying to figure out something motivational. And if in the end everybody says, well, you know what, things are just fine the way they are, well, you're probably not going to have enough. If you can't find enough of a compelling reason, then maybe you should just keep doing what you're doing, right? But there's typically always something that we could get better at. So it's usually something we can find. It just may not be the right time. It might not be the right environment based on that.
Awesome. So we have another question from Stacy asking, What about integrating maintenance of software versus new work? In our experience, maintenance emergencies interfere with focus. Do you advocate for a team to hand off maintenance of a product if they are working on new features?
Yeah, I think that the standard coaching answer of it depends. But let's go through a couple options together, right? So the first thing I'd want to know is a little bit more about how big your organization is, how many different products, so and to check out the viability of, yeah, one option is, say I had an organization of 6 teams on the same product, and that product, had enough maintenance support types of things to keep one team busy. Yeah, one optimization of reducing complexity would be to have one team go be the firefighting team that's probably doing Kanban more than it's doing Scrum, and 5 teams that might be doing Scrum that are focused on achieving the backlog. That is a structural way to reduce complexity so that all the teams aren't being interrupted all the time. The downside that people usually highlight there is that, well, the teams that are developing new features, they're not eating their own dog food, so they might write crappy code. Well, you know what? That's probably more of a cultural issue. It's like if the new development teams are okay writing crappy code and throwing it over to the support team to fix, there's probably something underlying that's more of a problem there, that I would look at. But I've also seen it where you do have teams that are trying to balance a little bit of both. The first thing I would do is measure the interruptions. So are the interruptions rare, less than 5% of your time? Okay, maybe that's fine. But if you said that the interruptions are 50% of the team's time, then that's going to be a significant problem. And so that's that. And if they're really volatile, right? Like it's like sometimes it's 20%, sometimes it's 80%. Well, then, anytime we're reducing complexity, we're attacking sources of volatility. So where is the volatility coming from? The other thing we want to do when we're trying to tune is get visibility to the problem. So measure how much interruption. I had somebody, we did an advanced Scrum Master class the last 2 days. We had somebody in there that said they were getting a lot of interruptions and it felt significant. They weren't real, sure. So they started to track all of them. I think even just with Post-its on a wall, like when you get an interruption, write it on a Post-it, put it on the wall. And in 2 to 3 weeks, they had 100 Post-its go on the wall, right? Which really exposed them to a huge problem. And they were able to show that to management, and the management who was really frustrated that the team wasn't getting as much done as they were supposed to. But they said, hey, yeah, we didn't get the 2 things that we were supposed to get done in our sprint, but we did do these 100 things over here. But that made visibility for management to then go say, all right, how could we reduce these 100 things? Where are all those coming from? And maybe we need to reduce it by putting more test automation in place so we have less of that comes later, right? That would reduce complexity in our system by actually getting more automation, fixing bugs, or refactoring code, doing some re-architecturing. Like those things could all come out of that as well.
All right, yeah, we've got one more question. He asks, any suggestions on how to get management to come up with an organizational and impediment management plan?
Yeah, so I think some of it. Let me at him. that's like let me talk to him. So I think the first thing you've got to figure out is how can you create awareness with them that this. I think it goes back to many people think Agile is just a team problem and not an organizational problem. So how can you expose so that they know and understand and have awareness that there is an organizational problem? Is that by all the Scrum Masters of teams just kind of raising visibility of all the organizational impediments, making that visible on a board somewhere? Is that helping them just kind of understand this journey Sending them, like we have a short version of the path to agility, like just helping. Sometimes I find that just going through, they're like, holy crap, this is a lot bigger than I thought it was. So what can you do to create awareness? That's one. The second is anytime you're kind of trying to influence up, there's definitely an element of trying to understand what is their pain, what is it from their view, it's kind of what's in it for me kind of stance for them, like what's in it for them, and trying to help shape it and frame it in a way that you're saying, okay, based on what they're trying to accomplish, I could come back to them and say, hey, these are the impediments in the way of, and it could be them, like the thing you're doing over here is actually causing you to not be able to do the thing you want to do over here, and helping frame it in a way where they can see it. I also was talking to a coach today that I really liked how he framed part of this. He said, approach it from a place of inquiry versus advocacy, right? Instead of coming in and telling him like, you're wrong and you need to implement this new process, come from a place of curiosity and questioning to try and help them kind of see what they don't see, and see if those leaders can kind of come to that conclusion themselves.
All right, that looks like all of our questions
Cool.
answered. Thanks again for joining us for your lunch hour, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.